Salvador. March, 1740. The sun lay on the Casa Grande like a brazier. Whitewashed walls drank the light and threw it back, blinding in the yard where the masters moved with fans and linen and the slow confidence of property. Beyond the courtyard, behind the row of fragrant guava trees, the senzala breathed in dust and sweat and the low, perpetual conversation of those who lived by other people's hours. Heat made everything closer, the smell of boiling cassava, the iron tang of sweat, the faint sweet of orange oil in the mistress's chambers. Sound traveled thin and sharp, laughter muffled by thick shutters, the clip of sandals, the slap of a hand against a thigh while a woman gave an order. Benedita carried 2 buckets at a time, as if she had learned the world balanced between her palms. She was 22, lean and quick, hair braided tight against her skull, a mouth that refused easy smiles. Her hands knew the texture of every surface in the house, the smoothness of porcelain tubs, the harsh grain of a wooden stool, the burnished curve of a copper kettle. She learned to read the day in the small things, the way Donna Constanza preferred her bath water scalding hot, the precise angle of the fan she kept near her dressing table, which window let a sliver of late afternoon shade into the corridor. She learned to move as if she were part of the house itself, a hinge in an otherwise closed circuit. Her mother had died when Benedita was a child, but the voice of that woman lived in her like a compass. "Never lower your head," her mother had said on the last night before fever took her, an admonition and a blessing. The phrase folded into everything, the way Benedita pulled her chin when a man leaned over her in the kitchen, the way she held her eyes when a white guest looked at the seam of her dress and then kept looking away, the way she steadied herself when a blow threatened to arrive. Never lower your head. It was not pride. It was a measure of survival, a decision to keep a visible thread of self that no one else could knuckle down and crush entirely. The insult began small and particular. On a morning stifling enough to make the floorboards sweat, Benedita came into the mistress's chamber with 2 buckets for the bath. The mistress was arranging her hair, fingers heavy with combs that glinted like teeth. A perfume, faint and unnatural, hovered around her. Benedita set the buckets by the tub and, careful as ever, tested the steam with the back of her wrist, the same movement she had repeated thousands of times. The water was hotter than the mistress liked it, too hot by a hand's breadth, and Benedita moved to add cold from the cistern. "It will scald you," the mistress said without looking up. Her voice was like a polished shell, beautiful but empty. "Watch what you do, girl." Benedita didn't flinch. She kept her eyes where they belonged and measured the temperatures. A finger to the water, a splash of cool, an adjustment of the embers beneath the kettle. "It's almost right, Sina," she answered, low and precise. The mistress laughed then, a brittle thing. "Almost right," she repeated, as if tasting the phrase like something foreign and amusing. "You and your guesses, you are clumsy. You always have been. There are insults that take a slow, internal bite, and there are ones that are meant to be seen." The mistress chose the latter. She reached forward in sudden movement and struck Benedita across the cheek. The sound was a neat, surprise cut. Benedita's head twisted. For a moment a bright star of pain bloomed at the cheek, and the world narrowed to the taste of iron and the sharpness of breath. "Mind your place," Donna Constanza said. Her lips were soft with mock concern. "You, who think you know better." Faces in the chamber did not blur. The Fator, Tomas, stood in the doorway with the easy posture of authority. 2 or 3 of the younger enslaved women hovered at the threshold with the rehearsed stillness of those who kept their faces blank to survive. Benedita's hand tightened on the bucket. A faint tremor went through her arm, and there was, just for a heartbeat, the thought of lowering her head, of touching a knuckle to her cheek and turning away. "Never lower your head." The words did not stop the sting, but they did make her look up. She did not, in that instant, make the mistake of answering with hot words. She had learned how dangerous words could be. One improper sentence could summon a lash. Still, The blow planted a seed that would not die. Humiliation had weight, and it gathered. It was not the first injustice Benedita had worn. She carried the memory of other slaps, other cold shelves of linen to lay her face on when she had nowhere to sleep, the hush of the Cenzala at night full of aching backs and mourning women. But this one left a particular bruise because it had been so public, because the mistress had struck where others watched her body hold the line between servant and human being. The household was a small theater of power. The masters performed dominance in obvious ways. Slaves learned the choreography of submission and the dangerous steps of resistance. Tomas announced the punishment with the bluntness of custom. 10 lashes at the tronco, he said to Benedita's face, as if reading from a ledger. There were no questions, only the law of the house speaking through him. The cane sung in his hand like a sentence waiting to be carried out. He pronounced the number and turned away, certain of his footing in the world. They took Benedita to the tronco, an old tree stump doubled at waist height, because walls were easier to manage than tender flesh. People were witnesses in a world that used other people's eyes to measure shame. The whipping was not meant merely to hurt, it was meant to mark you permanently as less than. Each snap of the lash was a syllable in the household's grammar of domination. Benedita's back reddened beneath the strokes. She tasted blood at the edge of her teeth. But she did not collapse beneath the blows. She breathed through it and counted silently. 1, 2, 3, like a ritual of endurance. Between strokes, her memory rose. The last night with her mother, a thin mattress on a wooden crate. The fever that made hands wild and hot. "Never lower your head," the voice had said. Not like an order, but like something smaller and harder and more precious. Benedita clung to those words like a shield, letting them stand between the lash and the private place where a girl once had been loved. The lashes were meant to break a body and a spirit in tandem. They failed on the spirit because an inheritance held fast. Back in the Senzala that evening, the other women mended, rubbed salves into her back. Her neighbor Palmyra, whose fingers moved with the competence of someone who had seen many such punishments. Annika, who hummed an old song and wrapped linen tightly. They worked in silence that yellowed the room with its own heat, and in that silence spoke the unspoken. Their hands were a language of small mercy. Pain is eloquent. It needs witnesses who will not betray. She pushed her, Palmyra said quietly as she mixed the salve, where she thought to be clever. Benedita closed her eyes and let the ointment sting. The salve smelled of bitter earth and herbs. "She?" Benedita began, but stopped. Words were combustible here. To explain why the slap had stung might be to ask for more pain, as though asking could be an act of rebellion worth punishing. But the women were not merely witnesses. They were a chorus, a network of shared risk by which one life could be carried when another needed saving. In the low voice of the Cenzala, plans took the form of half-sentences and small barter. A pot left to cool, a hearth left unattended for an hour, a pair of sandals quietly loosened. Each gesture was a tiny transgression against the strict calendar of the house. They taught Benedita how to keep her eyes open without drawing attention, how to make excuses that sounded like acceptance and tasted like resistance. "You hold to that proverb of your mother," Annika said, when the mending quieted. "Good words for a hard neck." "Never lower your head," Benedita whispered, the phrase both armor and a promise. Her hands flexed in the dim. She thought of the mistress's combs glinting like teeth, of the porcelain tub that shone with a cleanliness made from other people's labor, of the way heat pooled in the inner rooms like a thing waiting to be used. She thought of the whip and Tomas's small, satisfied face. She thought of the way Señor Juan Batista walked the yard like a patriarch who believed he owned the sun as well as the soil. Revenge was not a sudden metamorphosis. It is more often an arithmetic, the accumulation of small injuries, each adding mass until the burden moves toward a shape that can be acted upon. Benedita felt the tilt of that shape. It did not come with speeches. It came with observation, with patient attention to the house's rhythms. She began to map the Casa Grande as a cartographer makes a map by walking the land, tracing the mistress's hours, the master's departures, the pattern of the fater's watch. She learned when the señor would ride into town on business. She learned which shutters always closed at noon, and which remained open to the breeze. She learned that the mistress loved her baths scalding, and that the copper kettle that brought the water to the bathroom was always attended in the kitchen for a brief stretch when the mistress's maid lit the stove and then left to fetch a fresh towel. There is a kind of learning that hollows you out to make room for an act. Benedita's study was not academic. It was the slow compiling of opportunities. She sat at the kitchen hearth and watched the way the flame climbed the kettle. She took the stove's coals into her hands and felt their patient insistence. She watched Tomas's footsteps like one counting a metronome. Sometimes she spoke to the other women in curt sentences about the weather or a certain pot that refused to be clean. Other times she kept everything in, letting the plan form in silence. Tacit consent is a dangerous thing to describe. It is not always true that the oppressed make brave pacts with each other in full light, but in the Chenzala, small agreements were born of necessity. When Benedita murmured, once in a tone that was careful and thin, that there might be a way to stop the public slaps, the women did not laugh. They looked at one another as if the words had been a bell tolling in their own chests. Palmyra touched the handle of a pot. Annika shook her head minutely. "We must be careful," she said, as if the world were not listening. Careful was a code. It meant slow and sure. The plan took shape not in a single stroke, but in a series of manageable acts. Benedita learned to keep the embers hotter than she should, to make the kettle burn brighter, and to time its simmer so the water would reach a fever when needed. She practiced carrying the copper pot without tilting it, training her shoulders to bear the weight precisely, studying the kitchen pathway so as not to catch on a loose floorboard that squeaked. She observed the mistress's routine. Which day she insisted on being alone in the bath, which day she allowed the maid in, which mornings the señor left and did not return until dusk. Small, practical things, which together spelled out a possibility. The house had its own counterforces. Rumor moved in the corridors like a draft, almost nothing and too much. Fighters walked with their asses of authority, men who could, with the right anger, turn rumor into action. Benedita's plan had to be faster than rumor, and quieter than a whispered prayer. She set herself to the work of being invisible and present at once. That required a steadiness that felt new to her, the steadiness of someone who had learned to make a geometry of risk. Opportunity arrived with the discreet sound of a saddle. The señor had need of the port. His ledger required signature. The day widened like a hand that had uncoiled. "He leaves at dawn," Tomas declared to the household, the announcement as casual as a mark in a book. With the señor gone, the Casa Grande's axis shifted. Authority still existed, but was not the same. The mistress moved with a different kind of show. Perhaps she felt lighter for an hour. Perhaps she let herself a small solitude she could call luxury. Benedita watched the timing and felt the map of her plan settle more firmly into place. The day chosen was not a day of storms. It was bright and hot. The sky kept its modest blue. The mistress ordered the bath in the small hours of the afternoon, when the light slanted and made the porcelain tub gleam like an altar. Benedita had kept the embers alive for hours. She had tended the hearth as if it were a child, and she was protecting it from chance. The kettle sat on the stove, its copper like an animal's flank, its handle hot with patient readiness. Benedita's hands had practiced the balance of the pot until the memory lived in the tendons. There is a precise moment before an act when the world holds its breath. For Benedita, it was a cluster of small anxieties. The creak of the corridor floorboards, the faint, muffled voice of the mistress calling for towels, the slowness of the maid who had been bribed with a small promise for silence, a bowl of cassava bread left unexpectedly on her mat. The women had arranged what they could: a borrowed shawl, a hidden pair of sandals, a path of shadow that led from kitchen to the back gate. Each helper accepted risk in different measures. Palmyra would take the blame, perhaps, if the household pressed for an answer. Annika would say she had seen nothing. One of the younger girls would be punished if things went wrong. Each woman measured the trade and stepped anyway. Benedita did not harbor illusions about mercy. She knew the law of the house. She knew the likely consequences if she were caught. She had watched other women pay in blood and exile. She did not pretend that what she moved toward would be without cost. It was not vengeance as a narrative of righteous triumph. It was a desperate arithmetic of dignity. If something must be given up, she would choose where to expend the price, rather than have it chosen for her as if she were a thing in a ledger. On the way to the mistress's chamber, Benedita adopted a gait she had always used for servants: unremarkable, a neutral pace. Her sandals made the soft slap of familiarity on the boards. The house smelled of citrus and bath oils, of beeswax on polished surfaces. The mistress's chamber held an air of careful opulence: piles of folded linen, a casket of combs and pins, a small table with a porcelain bowl where the mistress mixed a perfume that smoothed the air like satin. Benedita set the bucket down beside the tub and waited as practices required. She had rehearsed the position of the kettle in her mind a dozen times, feeling in the muscles the arc and the steadiness that would be required when the moment came. The mistress undressed with the small theatricality of someone acutely aware of being desired. She lowered herself with perfumed sighs, then revelled in the heat of the water, breathing as one who bathed not to clean, but to be renewed in a ritual of privilege. There was a silence that belonged to houses of order, an absence of street noise, a hush preserved by curtains and closed shutters. It was in that silence that Benedita felt something else: the hum of her own pulse as a drumbeat of decision. Her memory of her mother's last breath offered itself like a small coin to be spent. "Never lower your head," it said. The phrase folded itself into an action rather than a posture. She lifted the kettle. The copper was perfectly balanced in her hands, a thing whose heft she had practiced. The heat bit her palms through the cloth wrap she had prepared for herself, but she did not flinch. She walked the short distance. There was a rhythm to everything: the mistress's soft breath, the tick of a clock in another room, the muffled shuffle of feet in the yard. Benedita leaned forward and poured. Sound breaks into the ordered world like a stone through glass. The scream that burst from Donna Constanza's mouth was not unlike that, a fracture, unexpected and perfect in its ruin. It was an animal sound, elemental and small against the room's cultivated airs. Benedita's shoulders moved with the plan, with a discipline learned through the counting of days. The water struck the mistress, intimately, unforgivably, and the light in the room turned into a storm of silver steam. For a heartbeat, everything was measured in sensation: the mistress's hands clawing at her face, the shock of hot water on skin, the staccato of sandals dropping as people ran to the corridor. The fighter's shout cracked like a whip. The sound was sudden and enormous because it was a breach of the house's quiet law. The porcelain tub, which had once symbolized gentle indulgence, now stood as witness to a violent reversal. But the moment that followed cannot be captured only in the motion of bodies. It is also in the fragments that trail behind: the scattering of towels, the mistress's raw, shocking cries into silence, the immediate realization that life at the Casa Grande would no longer fit into the small patterns that had once guided it. There was an engine of alarm. Tomas's face a mask of fury, the servants pushing into space like reeds in a current. The sound of feet on the stairs was both a promise of retaliation and the first note in an unraveling that might not knit back together. Benedita moved then with the speed of someone who had rehearsed escape in the soft hours of the night. Hands that had once set down pots now bore the weight of a choice. She slipped through the back door, every movement a practiced prayer, and into a world of shade and scrub that lay behind the household. Her lungs were full of the hot air of the yard. Her mind registered only the immediate, The small, expectant hand of Palmyra offering sandals, the rear gate that someone had left loosened, a path of scrub that swallowed sound. The hunt began with professional fury. Señor Juan Batista returned when he heard the news, all the authority of his name in the tilt of a shoulder. He swore and called names as if summonings could make the missing appear. Tomas rode his anger like a horse into the landscape. Fighters were sent, and the house quickly filled with a vocabulary of accusation. The mistress lived beyond the water's burn, but her sight was blunted, her world shrunk toward darkness. The injury had weight not only on skin but in the social geometry of the Casa Grande. A mistress who could no longer watch held a new vulnerability. A master who could not publicly restore order faced the empty space where authority should be felt. Within the senzala, the air had a different temperature. Not the heat of the sun, but the heat of shared risk. People moved in practiced secrecy. The women said little, letting actions speak. Sleek silence was a language that promised protection. They did not arrange stories easily for the masters. Instead, they created a small, resilient silence around Benedita's disappearance. Some among them took beatings and suspicion in exchange for a chance. Others collected water and whispers, building a lattice of small falsehoods that might confound the official search. Outside the Casa Grande, rumor began, as rumor always does, with 1,000 possible shapes. Some neighbors said they saw a woman slip into the scrub and vanish toward the back roads that led to the Sertão. Others swore she had boarded a small ship bound for an unknown port, one of those last measures of escape that required coin or contraband help. A third said she had been taken by quilombolas in the hills, a whispered hope that made certain women glance at the horizon as if the trees themselves might be hiding a salvation. None of these accounts could be confirmed. Rumor is at once proof and denial, a series of possibilities that can comfort or confound. The household's official record contained only a few clean notations: an attack, the mistress injured, a hunt begun. The search reached into nearby villages. Men chased footprints and questioned those who might have seen a figure with a bent gait or a pair of sandals left behind. The fighters promised themselves finality. Juan Batista vowed to find the woman and make an example of her, as if punishment could close a wound that had been opened in the heart of his home. In the days that followed, the Casa Grande changed shape. Donna Constanza moved more slowly, her world narrowed to familiar rooms. She sat near the windows and felt the sun in ways she had never needed to notice before. Someone who had always taken sight for granted had to relearn the form of things in darkness, how to feel for a comb, how to judge distance by sound. Her voice grew smaller, threaded with something like pity and something like fury. The servants found new mouths for the old roles. Where the mistress had once officiated over certain rituals, others now stepped in, and the choreography of the house shifted. As for Benedita, people told many stories because that was the only way to make sense of a life that had left a mark and then left the stage. Some said she had found refuge in a quilombo and learned to live in a different law, one not written by plantation masters. Some said she had crossed the water to a ship that would cast her into an uncertain freedom across the sea. Others insisted she had been taken and killed, a bleak account that closed on a single grim note. The truth remained untethered, a set of plausible directions with no final proof. But inside the senzala, the story was already work-worn into legend. Mothers repeated it as both caution and encouragement. The daughter who had borne a slap and made a choice that altered the life of a mistress and tested the mettle of a master. Children were told in low voices about the woman who would not lower her head, and the phrase became a kind of teaching: to hold yourself even when the world presses you to bend, to count your small acts like coins in a purse until you have enough to buy a chance. The story's moral was not simple. Some listened and thought of recklessness, others of courage. The community's response was mixed with fear and a brittle pride. Fear because the wrath of masters could be swift and wide. Pride because the enforcement of humiliation had a boundary someone had dared to cross. No one wanted to glorify harm, and yet the tale gave the people something rarer than a moment of spectacle, a sense that dignity could be defended in ways that turned the master's logic back upon itself. In the days after the incident, the Casa Grande's strict order found itself limp at the edges. There were more eyes in the kitchen and fewer in the drawing room. The mistress learned new methods of preserving a life that had been shattered in a manner both intimate and exposed. The master compensated with crescendos of wrath, a kind of authority that tried to be visible through machinations of law and bounty. The men sent to retrieve Benedita moved like men who believed the world to be owned, and that missing objects could be found if one looked hard enough. The women in the senzala did not sleep easily. They would sit at dawn and talk not of the marketplace but of the routes that led away from the finality of the plantation. They examined the map of possible refuge, hills where quilombos might hide, ports where ships might take in passengers for a price, even the porous edges of the city where a person could be a face in the crowd. Their talk had the cadence of people inventing hope from fragments. Palmyra would say softly, "If she is far, she will be hard to find." Annika would add, "If she is gone, she chose that." No one asked whether she had hurt the mistress deliberately. The fact lived in the air like a stone whose sides had been worn smooth by constant turning. On certain nights when the wind came down from the hills and put an ache in the bones, older women sat and told the story again, altering details like a tapestry retouched. With each telling, the woman who had poured the water gained a different hue. Once a vengeful spirit, once a cunning planner, once a martyr of indignity. The chant of the mother, "Never lower your head," was repeated often, and in its repetition took on new meanings. It became not merely a proverb, but a teaching about the precarious nature of selfhood inside a system bent on erasing it. Outside the sphere of the household, neighbors debated what justice might look like. Some feared the master would escalate. Some feared the master's humiliation would be more dangerous than his anger. The colonial town, with its ordered piazzas and half-hidden streets, found itself engaged in a quiet moral calculus. Fingers pointed. Others looked away. News traveled like a rumor bound in thread, tangible, but not always reliable. For Benedita, if she lived on, freedom would not appear like a bright door opening. It would be stitched together from the small acts that made days tolerable, a hand that offered a boiled cassava to the hungry, a voice that remained unbought by fear, a crooked path in the scrub where no patrols passed. If she fell into capture, then the story would become even more complicated, a caution that sometimes courage meets only punishment. The multiplicity of outcomes was the real thing. People carried the story so that it might do its work whether she was present to see it or not. And elsewhere, in the hush after the scream, the Casa Grande began to breathe differently. The mistress, blind now in a part of her world, discovered a new geography, a house to be learned by hand and sound. The master discovered the limits of his authority, how rings of control could be pierced by a single well-placed act. The fighters swore vengeance. The women stitched their quiet networks tighter and began to carry, in a new way, the sense that justice might be made where law failed. But the story had only begun to unravel the threads it had pulled taut. Plans could be made. Hunts could start. Lives could be remade. Benedita's face had vanished from the yard, but not from the minds of those who had touched the event. She existed now as both a person whose bones and guts had to be imagined, and a legend that would be articulated in many tongues. If you want more untold histories from colonial Brazil, stay with this story. The days that followed were a map of small resistances and loud reprisals. The master raised the price on anyone who might help. Tomas tightened the patrols. Fighters searched the roads. The women in the senzala took turns sleeping in shifts near the back gate, listening for the sound that meant danger, boots on the hard road or the carriage wheels that meant officials. Each night stretched into a thin, taut waiting. Voices in the market debated the possible fates. A rumor of Benedita's survival softened a woman's face at dawn, as if consolation could be borrowed. Benedita herself, if she lived to recall any of these days, would have found that the sensation of distance was a new kind of freedom and a new kind of terror. To leave was to gain sky and to lose certainty. To stay was to risk capture and a punishment that the law might sanction with cruel neatness. The path of escape requires small economies. Someone who offers a hiding place for a night in exchange for a cloak. A captain who takes a wage and offers a berth. These are the mechanics of running away in a world that runs on ownership. People traded in them quietly. And still the words of her mother kept steering her like a hidden compass. Never lower your head became a principle that mattered, not because it kept her unbroken, but because it insisted she choose the contours of her own life. She had been slapped, whipped, and humiliated. She had answered with an action that rewired the household's balance of power in an afternoon. The act had a moral geography that would not resolve into purity. There would be suffering left in its wake. There would be retribution. There would be the complicated calculus of what it means when a human being strikes back at the structure that dehumanized her. When the sun set on the Casa Grande that evening, shadows lengthened and pooled. Lanterns were lit and carried, small beacons that failed to fill the rooms with full light. The mistress sat in her chamber touching porcelain like a stranger. The master paced in the garden, muttering plans into the night air as if strategy could reconstruct the world's old order. The senzala gathered itself in a hush full of consequence. Benedita's absence was a kind of wound that would never wholly close. For some it would be a warning not to test the edges of power. For others it would be a lesson in daring. The town and the countryside debated and divided and stitched new assumptions into the fabric of daily life. And as stories do, this one began to take on its own life beyond the simple facts. The way a river carves its bed, and then tells its banks its own memory. What happened next unfolded along paths both earthly and rumor-struck. Journeys toward the hinterland, towards ships' dark bellies, toward hideouts that may or may not have existed. The men who sought her followed footprints and hearsay, and sometimes only the outline of a hope they could not name. The women who had helped her took their own quiet punishments and their own rewards, and learned to speak in the low language of complicity and survival. And in the quiet places between, children heard the story and felt in it a lesson shaped from the hard clay of living under a sun that belonged, in appearance, to someone else. The story would be told over fires for a long time. It would be altered, embroidered, softened, sharpened, and passed along until Benedita was sometimes a woman, and sometimes a symbol, sometimes both at once. The trail of smoke and rumor stretched into the hinterland, and men rode out in search with voices as loud as the thunder that sometimes rolled above the open fields. They took a map of assumptions with them, that a runaway would be found, that a punishment could be meted, that order could be restored. But maps are imperfect things. They omit the resourcefulness of those without maps, the way hidden paths form out of necessity. As the hunt pushed outward, some kept their eyes on the Casa Grande, watching how it folded and flexed under the strain. Others watched the road where hope might have walked. Each watched, each guessed. The future remained, for all of them, a field of indefinite possibilities, some small, some terrible, all unproven. And under the thin moon the house settled into a different rhythm, one stitched from vigilance, and a new kind of uncertainty. Women mended and whispered, men planned and cursed, and the story of the day, a woman poured boiling water in a mistress's bath, moved through households and markets like a low drumbeat. It would not stop being told simply because consequences had begun. By being told, it would change those who listened, shaping new questions about what dignity exacts and what the cost of insurrection might be. It would take time to see how the threads would knot and what would fray. Benedita's name, spoken softly in the lightless corners of the senzala, was now a living hinge between memory and possibility. The rest of the story would occur along routes people feared and others hoped for, roads leading outward toward the hills, boats cutting lines of water, the hunted learning new landscapes. The Casa Grande, for its part, continued to run on rituals that now carried ghosts, a house forever rearranged. The Casa Grande, for its part, continued to run on rituals that now carried ghosts, a house forever rearranged. News travels in patterns that are not linear. The first days after the escape were a flurry, mounted men cutting through scrub, questions asked in marketplaces with an edge of command, the raising of rewards written in ink on paper that fluttered from the master's hand like a proclamation. Fightors moved from porch to porch, their faces hard with the kind of certainty that believes the world is a thing to be corrected. They questioned travelers and fishermen, barked at innkeepers, examined footprints with a method that made the trackers proud of the small skill of reading a path. But the land remembers in ways the masters do not count on. Paths multiply, brush thickens, and goodwill, small and furtive, shields what official orders cannot reach. Within weeks, the search widened into a ritual of its own. João Batista's indignation took the form of measures, patrols late into the night, a harder tone adopted with servants, public punishments meant to rebuke the household into obedient fear. Tomás demanded names and places with a voice sharpened by wounded pride. "Bring me anything that smells of conspiracy," he ordered, as if a scrap of gossip could be taken down to a ledger and settled. Men who had never been entrusted with more than a whip were suddenly lawmen, convinced that the restoration of order lay within their capacity. The women in the senzala adjusted to a new vigilance. Where once the back gate might be left loose for a moment, in the certainty of unthreatened routine, now locks were checked 3 times. Small gestures of care multiplied. Palmyra slept in shifts at the weak points of the wall. Anika kept a bundle of warm bread hidden beneath her pallet in case a traveling hand needed food. The solidarity that had always existed, practical, secretive, sometimes grudging, hardened into deliberate practice. They practiced what to say when pressed, how to keep their faces blank and their stories short. Silence became a defense as careful and necessary as any woven net. Punishments followed. In a world that asserts ownership, the price for silence is often blood, or the threat of it. A younger woman, suspected of passing a message at the market, found herself taken to the yard and given lashes that left her body marked, and the household's temper satisfied for a time. Palmyra's name rose in questioning, her proximity to the back gate, the pair of sandals that had gone missing. She answered once with a calm that might have been bravery or resignation. Still, a browning bruise bloomed across her shoulder after a night of interrogation. And yet, when the household's eyes were elsewhere, coins slipped into another woman's palm. A cart's door was left ajar for a minute. A false trail laid for the trackers. Each small transgression was a calculus. What were the chances of discovery? What would be the consequences? And the women balanced those numbers in their heads like a market ledger. No one kept a public tally. The accounting was private and communal. Beyond the immediate orbit of the Casa Grande, the town took up the story as both scandal and a subject of low, eager talk. At the docks, men who handled cargo traded versions that made the plot more cinematic. The woman darting between crates, the hand that slipped a coin to a sailor who looked the other way. Innkeepers retailed each story with possibilities added and facts elided. Some merchants, perhaps hoping to profit, hinted that they knew of a captain who would take a person for a price and a name, but such claims were as often been a bargaining chip as a truth. Rumor fed rumor and grew teeth. It took on the substance of belief in places that wanted to imagine the world as movable by a single act. The supposed places of refuge multiplied in the telling. One voice would insist she had been seen climbing the ridge where the Colombos might hide, an answer that carried both terror and relief in equal measure. Another would swear to have watched a small boat, pushing off under cover of dawn, its figure swallowed by haze. A less hopeful thread held that she had been taken and done away with, the kind of ending that made people keep their hands close to their own hearths in fear. Each possibility did a different kind of work. Some offered hope to those left behind, others sharpened the edge of caution. No official record could be produced that proved any single claim. The truth, like a hidden spring, persisted under layers of conjecture. Donna Constanza's life folded into a new contour. Losing sight is not merely a removal of an organ's function, it is the redrafting of a world into tactile and auditory features. Where she had once judged linens by eye and ordered rooms by the light that fell across them, she now learned to map the house by sound and memory. Fingers became cartographers. A comb's location was learned by the way it knocked softly against wood. A dress's fold was known by the whispering cup of fabric. She would sit at a window and feel the sun as if it were an object to be cupped in both palms and read like braille. Her fury, when it rose, took a softer, deeper form. There were moments she would sit in the dark and say the names of servants aloud, not as a roll call but as a way to remember faces she could no longer see. Sometimes, unexpectedly, her voice threaded with something like pity when a servant passed too close, and she felt the human shape of the household as one might the curve of a familiar body in the dark. The master's response to the insult that had deformed his household was a performance in its own register. João Batista sought to reimpose order with punishments given publicly, with notices of reward that promised a sum to any who could return the missing. He sent men to villages beyond, and rode himself further, and with more visible agitation than before. Yet there was an incoherence to his wrath. His authority had been shown to be pierced by a single act, and the knowledge of that incision seemed to make his fury less precise. He ordered measures that made the household's daily life more brittle. Curfews, new rules about visitors, the inspection of packages entering the yard. But bitterness is not a strategy for discovering what a network of people has agreed to keep secret for reasons of survival. The men hired to follow trails brought back little beyond interviews and suppositions. They returned with the mismatched reports that rumor produces. Footprints that ended at a stream, a scrap of cloth found in a hedgerow, a fisherman who swore he had seen nothing but the sea and a gull. Some returned with stories of near captures, of nights spent under the stars waiting for a shadow that never came. Thus the hunt stretched months and then seasons, until the shape of it began to look less like a sprint and more like a long-assigned task whose momentum could only be maintained by the master's stubbornness. In the Senzala, time itself began to tell the story in layers. People marked the months not only by the calendar, but by the smaller registers, the first rains after the escape, the new rounds of crops, the births that tempered the dread of constant vigilance. Newly arrived women listened to the story and adjusted their behavior accordingly. The tale of Benedita functioned as a lesson and a warning. Some younger women took the story as a lesson in craft and cunning. Older women told it as a tale of moral complexity. The chorus that had thickened around Benedita's plan continued to hum, a communal sound made of both fear and a possessed pride. She knew what she was doing, some would say, not to flatter but to assert the seriousness of her decision. Others would give voice to misgivings. Perhaps she thought too little of what would come. A line said in caution, an attempt to keep the young from romanticizing what was in truth a desperate measure. There were those who claimed by the hearth that they had glimpsed Benedita's light in the distance, a brown skirt disappearing into a copse, a figure that bent low to hide itself in a ditch. Others told stories of how she had adapted, learning to move with the land, to make a day's food of roots and boiled manioc, to listen for patrols and keep to ridgelines. The women whose lives had interlocked with hers were content to imagine these outcomes because imagining was a way of softening the sharp edges of fear. For them, the mere possibility that she might be living in a place where she chose her own rhythm and law was more sustaining than the most forceful pronouncement of retribution. An undercurrent of complicity threaded through parts of the town. Not everyone who was compelled to help did so out of solidarity born of equal suffering. There were sailors who saw an advantage in a secret fair, merchants who traded in favors, and freed folk at the margins who knew how to slip a person through a border, because they had once had to slip themselves through one. These were the hidden mechanics of escape, a cloaked berth in a cargo hold, a bag of coin handed discreetly to a captain at the crack of dawn, the smooth lie of someone who would claim they had never left their stall that morning. None of it was romantic. Each exchange was a negotiation where the stakes were high, and the currency often made up of trust, bought at a risk. Sometimes, too, the possibility of capture or betrayal crept from unlikely sources. A woman in the market might be tempted by the mention of reward. A man who had been cruelly treated by the master might think to send a false tip to watch the master's purse grow thinner. The social ecology around the plantation was not either or. It was a mixed field. There were people who hated the master's orders, and others who saw in the chaos an opportunity for gain. Against such complexity, the collective caution of the senzala was only one line of defense. As months settled into the new calendar of the household, the story of the bath became more and more of a thing told in different voices. Mothers taught children a version that cut the sharpest edges, the heroine who would not bow. Others gave a harder teaching, a cautionary tale about the cost of defiance. Songs grew around it, small rhymes that could be hummed low under the breath, lines that children repeated and turned into plays in the yard. The refrain of the mother's old counsel, "Never lower your head," moved through these variations like a seed that assumed new forms with each planting. Rumors, shaped by appetite and dread, took on settings and costumes. A woman in the hills would tell of seeing a fire at night that marked where a new community had gathered. A sailor would boast of a transient passenger who was quick with hands and handsomer with grief. An old man nursing rum at a tavern might insist he had once seen a figure working quietly at the edge of a field, a woman who refused the sun's hurt and who smiled without needing permission. The multiplicity of claims allowed for the possibility and the impossibility of Benedita's fate to sit together in townspeople's minds. Each rumor relieved someone of a different kind of burden, the fear of what reprisals might still come, or the unease of acknowledging that a house could be unsettled by the force of a single human decision. The household itself changed in subtle structural ways. The mistress's blindness altered domestic routines. The places that had been under visual scrutiny became more guarded by touch. Servants walked the rooms in a different choreography, hands stretched like compasses across furniture, voices that had been curt becoming more precise about the arrangement of objects. The master's overcorrections, inspections and punishments made the house's heir taut. But they also exposed a truth he could not fix with orders. Power relies on the perception of inevitability, and when that perception is pierced, authority becomes sharpening, reactive, and less secure. As seasons shifted, the story bled outwards. Neighboring plantations took notice and adapted their own patterns. A rumor of one plantation's crack undermining could encourage others to tighten their own measures prematurely, and in each tightening there is the risk of producing more unrest than a single example of resistance could create. Men debated where justice lay and how to meet it. Some argued for public retribution to quiet rumor, others for caution so as not to inflame further whispers. The larger colonial apparatus, the parishes and local officials, watched with a mix of curiosity and fear, for an event that disturbed a plantation's order could, by multiplication, become an unpredictable upheaval. Among the enslaved, the tale of Benedita was not merely an anecdote, it became a living part of a moral vocabulary. It offered, in a fragmentary way, an argument about self-possession, that even when the law of the land considered bodies property, inside a human, there remained faculties that the law could not account for: memory, calculation, conscience. The women who had aided her felt a complicated pride mixed with the weight of the punishments they had endured to keep their mouths closed. They spoke little of heroics. They spoke in quotidian trades. She did what she had to, or we helped because we remembered ourselves. Those small phrases were not absolutions. They were records of a choice that cost, and of the way a community estimated its own risks. Over time, some of the immediate sharpness dulled. The master's rage, though it never fully subsided, became lodged in other forms: suspicion, attacks on imagination, an attempt to teach children the terrifying lesson that their freedom could be wrenched away by a single white hand. This attempt at deterrence had its limits. Children who learned stories like sunlight took the tale and hollowed it into fable forms that were easier to hold. In the Cenzala, a child might play a game where one took the role of the mistress, another of Benedita, and mothers would watch with guarded amusement. The game turned a violent act into a rehearsal of boundaries. What is permitted, and what is not, and why. Years, in their passing, leave certain marks. The master's ledger thickened with entries unrelated to the incident. Crops were planted and harvested, and life continued with its small necessities. Yet some mornings, João Batista would sit in his study and regard the blank space in a chair where once a woman might have sat to polish silver. His thoughts would return, perhaps not to the water itself, but to the humiliation that had sparked the chain. For him, the event remained an incision in a fabric of control he had thought unbreakable. For others, it became part of a folklore of the place, shaping how people thought about action, consequence, and the remoteness of justice. As memory did what memory does, the story accrued a certain mythology. People would insist, with the stubbornness of those who have felt the effects of a narrative, that the woman had become various things: a spectre that haunted the mistress's dreams, a teacher who had shown where the cracks in the system lay, an outlaw who had paid the ultimate price. Songs hardened into refrains. She didn't bow, one line chanted at gatherings, a small chant that bore both pride and the weight of what had followed. With the passage of time, the telling of Benedita's name itself shifted, being pronounced differently in different houses, sometimes with reverence, sometimes with a hollow caution that seemed designed to say quietly, "Do not try this." What secure facts remained? That Donna Constanza had lost her sight in part, that João Batista had pursued leads, that a woman named Benedita had vanished from the Casa Grande shortly after the incident. What did not remain secure was the path that Benedita took afterwards. The multiplicity of claims, quilombo, ship, capture, served as an index not so much of uncertainty, but of the community's need to hold multiple possible outcomes at once. Each version fulfilled a different emotional economy. Hope, fear, the sober acceptance of a life measured in losses. The truth, to those who had remembered the woman, mattered less than the fact that the act had happened, and that it had altered how they all thought about their place in the order of things. In some quarters, the event was used as an object lesson, a demonstration of the cost of defiance. In others, it was quietly celebrated as an act of reclaiming a piece of human dignity. The narrative resisted simple moral closure, as the cost had been real and painful, and sometimes indiscriminate. People who spoke of the lady's blindness spoke of the years of fumbling and retreat that followed. Others whose lives had improved slightly, if only by ownership of a small liberty, spoke of that improvement not with triumph, but with a memory that cut into them. The story left in its wake an ambiguity that refused easy answers, and perhaps that was the clearest truth of all. History does not simply reward or punish like a moral fable. It leaves consequences that ripple and fold, that affect those far from the original scene as surely as the wave from a stone thrown into a pond reaches the banks. Across years, the story began to be told further from the place of its making. Travelers carried tales to neighboring towns, free black men on coastal boats, who had their own networks and reasons to pay heed to rumors, passed along versions that shifted with every telling. At distant markets, a woman might recount the event as a parable about keeping one's head. Never lower it. And a man in another province might hear it as evidence of the fragility of authority. In that spreading, the story stopped being the property of the Casa Grande and became a communal thing that belonged to the many who told it. It reached the ears of children who would never see the plantation and became, for them, a name that meant something like instruction. Watch the world, keep your small acts of dignity, and understand that when the law fails to see you, sometimes you must see yourself. Even as the legend grew, some chose to keep the memory grounded in the body of fact, what had been witnessed and what could be proved. Records, sparse and stern, listed an attack on the Mistress and the subsequent search. The official papers made no moral argument. They made a bureaucratic one, a document of disturbance. Oral history, by contrast, embroidered and interpreted. It is in the tension between these registers, the written, which prefers to distill, and the oral, which prefers to weave, that the story found its longest life. and so the question of Benedita's fate remained, as it had from that first night she slipped into the scrub. Unresolved, a set of paths that the years did not converge upon, but instead allowed to exist side by side. Some said she had reached a quilombo and was living in a law that felt to her like a return of dignity. Others said she had crossed the water and was making her life in a strange land, where she would rebuild identity from the small, essential things. Still others feared the worst, that she had been captured and punished, her name erased from life in the way owners sometimes sought to erase the inconvenient. Each possibility served as a different balm or hardening. None could be called altogether true. The story's endurance lay in its capacity to carry more than one truth. For a woman in the Senzala, it could be both a template for courage and a warning about cost. For a child, hearing it at night, it might be a lodestone, to keep one's bearing, to never lower the head when the world asks for bowing. For the master, it remained a wound, a demonstration that control could be interrupted by a moment of human agency. For the town, it became part scandal, part cautionary tale, and part a narrative of social complexity. When songs took the tale, they shortened it, intensifying the key note, an insult, a lash, a plan, a burn. The cadence grew tight and memorized, easier to carry than the long, careful prose of days and measures. Mothers hummed these lines at dusk, as if a rhythm might anchor understanding. The mother's voice, "Never lower your head," moved from being private counsel to a communal chant. In that change, it acquired a double edge. It was both affirmation of self and a demand of hardness that life often forced. At the edges of the story, there were quieter, less public moments that did not enter the ledger of legend. An old woman, who had once mended Benedita's shirt, kept for years a small scrap of fabric folded under her pillow. It was a talisman she did not show to anyone. Palmyra would sometimes touch a scar and recall the heat of interrogation. She would press the memory into a private place and go on with a life that included both the shame and the solidarity of what she had done. Annika, who had hummed while tending wounds, would sometimes sit by her fire and imagine the ways a person might remake a life far from the place that had tried to define them. The house itself, now rearranged, settled into a modified routine. There were more locks and fewer impromptu conversations in open courtyards. The servants moved under a different choreography, a series of cautious steps that reflected both fear and the learned capacity to survive under shifting conditions. The mistress learned to navigate the rooms by touch, to assess someone by breath and the brush of a skirt. The master learned to watch his words and to exercise a wrath that increasingly looked like caution. The balance of the Casa Grande was no longer what it had been. It had been altered by a single violent moment that would resonate across years. The story continued to be told in many tongues, and in each the telling did different work. To some it was a story about dignity reclaimed. To others, a lesson about the terrible costs that such reclaiming often required. The moral clarity of the tale resisted a single verdict. That, perhaps, was its deepest power. It forced listeners to keep a multiple gaze, one that could hold both the urgency of indignation and the discomfort of its consequences. If any lesson lived longest of all, it was the persistence of memory as a form of resistance. The small acts by which women protected one another, the loosening of a bolt, the care in the kitchen, the silence at the right time, were less visible to official record, but integral to survival. They were the other side of the story, the quiet infrastructure that allowed one woman to choose the terms of a terrible decision. This infrastructure did not make the choice easy or inevitable. It merely offered what aid could be mustered under a system designed to deny its subjects the possibility of choosing altogether. Decades later, in rooms warmed by different suns and lit by different lamps, the story would be told again. It would be changed into parable, into song, into a cautionary tale, and into a rallying point for those who remembered how small acts of dignity could rattle great orders. Some who listened would go on, years after, to whisper the words to their daughters. Never lower your head. They would say it not as incitement to violence, but as the old woman's counsel, a way to look up into a world that repeatedly asked people to bow and, for reasons of survival and self-possession, to refuse. What became of Benedita? Whether she lived quietly in a place no record names, whether she crossed water and found a new life away from the reach of the plantation, whether she was captured and punished, none of these can be said with certitude. The people who were there remembered what they had seen at the time, but after that the world offered a set of plausible paths and refused to choose one. Perhaps that is the truest part of the tale, that an act meant to reclaim an instant of dignity created a knot of consequences too large for any single ledger. The tale remained, therefore, both a history and a legend. In the silence after the scream, the Casa Grande learned the shape of a different order. In the Senzala, women learned anew the measures of risk and the vocabulary of protection. In the town, conversations altered, and across the region, songs and whispers carried the story like a weather front that could change how people thought about the fragile edges of power. There are days when history demands a verdict, and days when it gives us only stories. This is one of the latter. The story of the woman who poured the boiling water into her mistress's bath in March of 1740 does not yield to a tidy moral. It refuses to sit wholly as an exemplar of courage or as a cautionary tale against vengeance. It is instead the tangled record of a life under ownership and the desperate measures a person could take when all other doors were locked. It is a story about memory and the force of small communities that, in their everyday practices, hold lives together. It is a story that taught a household, if not the whole world, that power can be pierced and that consequences will follow. If this account has moved you, share it with someone who should hear these histories. Seek out more stories that complicate what we think we know about the past, because in this complication, there is a truer sense of what dignity and resistance cost and what they might mean.